think every project starts with a feeling, not a plan. You see something in your head, can't stop thinking about it, so you make it real. This was the prototype. I threw it together in a weekend, then stood back and thought, wow, this thing is ugly. It didn't work either. The button jammed every time I pushed it, way too much water pressure. I knew I could do better. Step 1, build the box. I chose African mahogany because I knew that once I oiled it, it'd really come to life. You'll see that part later in the video. I figured I'd knock the box out in about an hour. I mean, how hard could it be? It's just a box. Stupid thing took 4 days, mostly because I had the wrong tools. A circular saw is not the right choice, but it's what I had. Sanding was next. Basically my punishment for using the wrong saw. 240 grit, slow, tedious, the kind of work that makes you question your hobbies. But I knew that if I stuck with it, no shortcuts, no excuses, I'd have one killer fountain. I used wood glue to put it together. Wood glue's no joke, stronger than screws, stronger than nails, but I didn't just want a plain box. I wanted details that made it stand out, something that looked intentional, something that felt custom. The answer was these decorative screws. They've got brass screw caps that thread on and hide the screw heads. You'll see them later in the video. Before this project, I didn't even know these things existed. Hey, look at that. It's actually starting to look like a box. Aside from using the wrong tools, there was one more thing that made building it a challenge. Warping. If even one board isn't perfectly flat, your corners don't line up, and that sets off a domino effect that throws everything out of alignment and sends you right back to Home Depot for round 2. The next step was building the stand to hold the bottle. If I'd had a solid block of mahogany, I could have just used that. I didn't. What I did have were leftover scraps from the box. I chopped up a bunch of pieces, glued them together, clamped them in a vise, and cut the edges clean on the chop saw. Now I could have just used a couple of cheap 2x4s. No one would ever see that part, so why waste expensive mahogany? But then I remembered a story about Steve Jobs. Jobs said his father taught him that when you build a nice cabinet, you put good wood on the back, even if no one will ever see it, because you'll know it's there. Later at Apple, Jobs carried that same lesson into the design of the Macintosh. He made his engineers lay out the circuit board inside the computer like a piece of art, even though customers would never open the case. That stuck with me. No one's going to see the inside of this fountain, but I'll know, and I didn't want cheap lumber hiding in there. Next, I'll drill a hole in the bottle for the pump tube. Drilling glass isn't difficult, you just have to know how to do it. First, you'll need this, a diamond bit. See how it sparkles? Those are tiny pieces of diamond. We also need something to hold the bit steady while you drill. That's where this comes in. Moldable plastic. Fun stuff. It starts as these tiny white pellets that melt at a low temperature. You just pour on boiling water, and when it turns clear, it's soft and ready to shape. You can mold it into just about anything. A missing dishwasher knob, a stand for your phone, a tiny replacement leg for an action figure. I'm using it to make a guide for the drill bit. Without it, the bit just wants to skate and bounce across the glass. The moldable plastic keeps everything locked in place, and when it comes to drilling glass, this stuff is clutch. Once it hardens, I'll dip the whole thing underwater to keep the glass cool while I drill. These Johnnie Walker Blue bottles are thick, so it takes a minute. You'll see the bubbles start to appear, and there it is, the hole. Look at that. Perfect. Exactly what I wanted. And when you're done, you can just reheat the plastic and use it again. Watch this. You know I had to sneak that in there. Alright, moving on. This is the tube for the pump. I'm adding a little hot glue around the edge, then carefully sliding it into the hole I just drilled. Nice and snug. Next, I'll attach the bottle to the stand. First, I'll rough up the glass for better adhesion, then glue it with epoxy, clamp it down in a vise, and let it dry overnight. This was one of my big mistakes in the prototype. Back then, I didn't trust the glue to hold the bottle, so I came up with this over-engineered plan to drill through the base of the bottle, then tie it down with wire. Yeah, it didn't work. The bottle broke, it looked awful, and the whole thing collapsed under its own complexity. I actually uploaded that disaster to my Patreon page. The video is free to watch. You don't have to pay anything. Check it out if you're curious. I'll drop the link in the description. So here's the pump, 50 gallons per hour. This switch controls the water flow, and it even comes with an LED light, which I'll use so the fountain can glow at night. You know, in case you need to refill your glass in the dark. This is a floor switch from a lamp, and I'm going to cannibalize it to make the on-off button. From the very beginning, I knew I wanted a power switch that stood out, not some hidden thing in the back, but something bold right on the front, something that would elevate the whole setup. The wiring itself was pretty straightforward. These buttons aren't exactly rocket science. But one problem I ran into was that the wires were too soft to push into the switch. I had to dig out the old soldering gun and tin the ends. And I'll confess, I've never been totally comfortable working with electricity. When I was a kid on vacation in Mexico, I brushed against some exposed wires sticking out of a wall and got a pretty nasty shock. I think that memory's still in there somewhere every time I plug something in. The trickiest part about the whole button setup was getting it to mesh perfectly with the wood. Everything had to fit just right. Another reason I'm glad I built the prototype. There's something satisfying about this part, the slow process of wrestling chaos into something that finally works. You start with this vague idea of what you want, then gather the parts you think you need. None of it fits together the way you imagined, but you keep tinkering, and little by little it starts to make sense. The gaps close, the pieces line up, and suddenly it's not just a mess on your workbench anymore. It's a thing that actually works. Of all the challenging little details I had to figure out on this fountain, the on-off button is the one I'm most proud of. It took time, trial and error, some cussing, a few trips to Home Depot, but it turned out great. The final touch on the switch was was using the bottle's cork. It's an iconic cork from a classy bottle, and it just felt wrong not to give it a second life. Next up, linseed oil. This part's always kind of fun. You get to watch the wood wake up, go from bland, dry boards to a deep golden brown. There's something satisfying about it. The grain deepens, the color shifts, and suddenly the wood looks like it's got a story to tell. After the linseed oil comes wood butter, basically skincare for wood. It's beeswax, mineral oil, keeps moisture out in case whiskey splashes where it shouldn't. It's a slippery slope with this stuff. Once you use it on one thing, you start walking around the house looking for excuses to use it. Cutting boards, wooden spoons, the salad bowl you haven't touched in 5 years. Everything starts looking a little dry. Remember the decorative screw caps I mentioned earlier? These are them. You just screw them on and suddenly the whole thing looks intentional. Clean, finished, like it was built by somebody who actually knew what they were doing. It's a small detail, but it really pulls the box together. Now I'll build a platform to hold the rocks. Here's the frame. I used mahogany again and gave it a quick stain. This is an aluminum screen that I'll cut to size. In the prototype I used wire mesh. It was easy to work with, but the rocks I wanted to use were too small. They slipped through the holes and landed in the bucket. That's not what I mean when I say I want my whiskey on the rocks. Screw it down nice and tight. As you can see, I'll need to cut a hole. This part took some careful measuring. I actually made a cardboard version first to figure out exactly where I wanted to cut. It's one of those moments you really hope to get right the first time. I did not want to make another trip to Home Depot for another screen. Okay, here's the hole. The goal is for it to just barely slip over the bottle, tight enough so no rocks can fall through the cracks. This looks great. The next step is to cut a hole for the light. I'll wrap a thick wire around it to hold it in place. The pump I used in the prototype didn't have a light, so this part's completely new. Using a thick wire seems obvious now, but it was deceptively tricky to figure out. My brain kept going back to zip ties. Easy to find, easy to use, but they would have looked awful and been a nightmare to adjust. Finally landing on the wire idea felt like a breakthrough. Funny how the simplest, most obvious solution always takes the longest to find. You circle around it for days like it's hiding behind some secret engineering principle, when really, it's been sitting in plain sight the whole time, right next to the drawer full of zip ties. Next, I'm going to cut the bottle, then sand and polish it. I won't go through the whole process here. If you want the full deep dive, there's a 16-minute version of this video that walks through every step of the build, along with a pair of how-to videos that explain my process in detail. So we'll skip ahead. Here's the glass, fully polished. People sometimes ask if I sell the glasses I make. I don't. For me, it's just a creative outlet. There's something satisfying about taking an old bottle that's been tossed aside and giving it a second life. Time to drill another hole. Same process as before with the moldable plastic, but this part made me nervous. The first hole I drilled was through the side, where the glass is thinner and easier to work with. But the base of these bottles is a whole different story. The glass is absurdly thick. I'd already spent a good amount of time sanding and polishing the rim, and the last thing I wanted was to hear a crack. Fortunately, the glass cooperated. Alright, time to fill this beast. Did I really use Johnnie Walker Blue Label for this? Some people will see the bubbles and say, no, Johnnie Walker doesn't bubble like that. Others will say I poured the bottles too fast, which could have caused the bubbles. Either way, let's just agree it's a good illusion. Or maybe it isn't. The rocks are polished marble, smooth, heavy, they really catch the light. So there's just one thing left to do. Test it. I'll admit, I was a little nervous for this part. I hadn't tested it before now because I wanted to experience the same first moment you're seeing. Other than the prototype, this is the first real run. And as you can see, it works beautifully. I ran it for an hour just to make sure there were no leaks. Right now, it lives on the bookshelf in my office. Every once in a while, I'll switch it on just to hear the sound. There's something oddly calming about it. It's a reminder that sometimes the best things we make come from just following a strange idea until it turns into something real. Kind of like being a kid again, building things in the garage just because we could, or taking them apart just to see how they worked. Anyway, if you enjoyed this video, send it to someone who might get a kick out of it. Your dad, your weird uncle, or your sister who loves Johnnie Walker. And if you want to see some behind the scenes stuff, check out my Patreon. Full access is a whopping $5 a month, which won't even buy you a weak cocktail these days. It's a simple way to support the channel. Either way, thanks for being here. It really does make the whole process worth it. And if you have any questions about the fountain, drop them in the comments and I'll write you back.